Today I'm speaking to a man who is one of the most inspirational people on my Facebook feed. And every time he posts something, I pause and I read it very carefully. And then I contemplate a little bit about it. And then I continue. But before we get into the conversation, please tell us, who are you?
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me on tonight. It's nice to be in discussion with you. My name's Daniel Pohl, Canadian father, husband, engineer, genius, a soulful person. Many different aspects could address that question, but I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. That's like without any hesitation there, just, a bunch of aspects and facets. So what is it to you? And this is one of the reasons why I have massive respect for you, apart from the fact that you're a soulful guy and all this kind of stuff, is that you're a genius. So let's start there. What does it mean to be a genius, both in sort of formal way as well as the way you look at it?
The formal way typically is to define a distribution of results based on standardized testing. So you need a sufficient sample size. And based on those test results, which may or may not be good tests, to be honest, you define a number of standard deviations above the mean at which you would consider someone a genius. And typically with the more mainstream tests, that's 3 standard deviations above the mean, or more specifically, it's an IQ of 145, where the standard deviation is 15. In terms of what I consider to be a genius, it sort of deviates from that. I'm of the philosophy that anyone can be a genius. In fact, we're all geniuses at being ourselves, I like to frame it. There's almost an epidemic to use statistics to compare ourselves. We're not the same. Every person I've met is uniquely individual. And it's almost a shame to limit them by comparisons to others. Every person seems to be a universe unto themselves, where you can explore the various facets of their being, and they are able to reach places no other individual can reach. And that, in its essence, is the definition of a genius. Obviously, there are more pragmatic measures of being a genius, and there are the multiple intelligence types. And you can go into that and define specific skill sets for where one individual can obviously exceed the abilities of another individual. But on the whole, it's really unfair to us as individuals to do that cross comparison, in my opinion.
So do you think that it's possible to get to the bottom of oneself, to the core essence of oneself? And if so, what happens then?
I think as you mature in life, there are definitely different directions in which you can take that question. In terms of reaching a bottom, no, I don't think there's reaching a bottom, which is actually motivation for myself. I learn new things about myself every day. I learn new things about the people I'm close with, including yourself. I love to watch your Facebook feed as well. Very motivational things, where I see it as a two-way relationship, where I continue to explore myself, like I said, as a limitless universe, as well as learn from each other. It's great. It's the teacher-student relationship. I'm a teacher, but I'm also a student of everyone I encounter. There's no person you can't learn something from, and use that information, that lesson they provide you, as a reflection on yourself. And just like you would change your hairstyle and look in the mirror and consider yourself slightly different, I consider those relationships life-altering as well. And so people change me. I change over time. I take in new lessons, and I like to evolve. It's the joy of being alive.
I tend to look at these conversations as soul conversations. As we said briefly before we started recording, I said, I don't know what I'm going to ask you. And that's part of the fun here, because literally all these first couple of questions that I asked, I can't even remember them anymore, but certainly didn't pre-plan them. And so I trust the process that what I ask you is going to yield some new insights for both of us. And I must absolutely admit and mirror the fact that I feel both. Well, basically, I'm learning from you through this, and inevitably from myself. I'm going like, where did that question come from? So, where does intelligence come from?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that hasn't been answered, at least by no measure of consensus. There are various schools of thought that I've encountered. In terms of my personal understanding, I really do go right to the fundamental levels. As you may know, I'm a nuclear engineer, and part of that was studying nuclear physics and subatomic particles and forces. So I tend to break things down very abstractly, trying to get to the essence of truths. So as far as I can tell, intelligence is the ability to observe the environment and adapt by effectively recognizing what you need to do in order to make it to the next moment in time. So that's a very evolutionary way to frame intelligence, but I think it's more basic than that. Everything, as far as I can tell, has some sort of a memory. And if you think about it in terms of physical parameters, you might not think a rock, much of a rock. It's sort of one of these base things that are always around, and we throw rocks, we kick rocks, that we don't give them a second thought. But when you actually think about what they are, they have a molecular structure. They're relatively uniform. If you start to inquire and drill down into what they actually are, they have a set of physical parameters which one could consider as a history or a memory even of what they've been through in the universe. They have a certain awareness, as I like to put it. I know that rubs some philosophers the wrong way when I say awareness, but I really do just mean an information capacity. They store information in a specific form, and when you look at it, you can recognize there's significance there. At some point, that shifts to consciousness for myself. So I consider the larger set awareness, and that just means existence for me, really. And then the smaller set is consciousnness. And you can think of many different definitions for consciousness as well. Some of them are just an ability to think, cognito ergo sum, but some are more strategic in nature, and intelligence is I consider it a subset of consciousness. So on the whole, you've got this large awareness, then consciousness, and then intelligence is a smaller subset of phenomena that occur within those larger spheres.
That all reminds me of a talk by Alan Watts, which is entitled Higher Than a Potato, where he talks about how we're not really able to necessarily know whether a potato is more intelligent or less intelligent and conscious than we are. Because when you start inquiring into potato's life, you might say, well, it's just a stupid potato. It's in the ground. It doesn't have eyes and so on. But then really, potato is just chilled in the ground. It's away from all the hustle and bustle of the external world. it's just calm there. It's not trying to buy yet another car or pay a bill or a mortgage. And it's pollinated by bees, which are his friends and all that kind of stuff. So Potato's doing something very smart. uh, in fact, many of us want to be more like the potato and be able to just be comfortable being grounded in a way that isn't like, oh well, I just want to be somewhere else now, anywhere but here. And so, tell me a little bit about then, how do you conceptualize universe as a, so this is, you pointed to the thing there that's fantastically essential, the nuclear stuff and all this atomic universe. Right now, what we're doing is, I'm writing a book called Designed Company, but really what it is about is what I call fractal management. So it's like breaking down every task, every project into atomic units of tasks, and then saying we should be having a system that enables us to manage any project under the sun, quite literally, through atomic units of tasks that build towards delivering that project. And the system seems to be working much better than we envisaged. So you, as a nuclear physicist, how do you actually, nuclear engineer, how do you actually conceptualize of the universe? Do you see atoms as material units, or are they just more of a kind of clusters of tetrahedrons, as someone like Jim Carrey would talk about? And you know what is universe actually made out of?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you can come at it from many angles. And for many years, as someone coming from what we call the hard sciences or the physical sciences, I wanted to view it from the lens of science. And there were all sorts of personal biases that led me down that road. Arrogance was definitely one of them, and there are some other psychological predispositions that made me think in that way. But in terms of what the universe actually is, it really does change based on the lens you use, the instrument that you use. So in reality, I think all of them are correct. I mean, to be honest, we're having these different thoughts in a universe. And in some sense, if I'm using a scientific lens, that's correct because I'm using the lens. So the caveat is that you're viewing it in a certain way. And obviously that perspective happens. We can't deny the fact that that actually happens. If I view it from a spiritual lens, it's also correct because I'm using that specific lens. So in some ways, I like to create a network of ideas using these different tools that we have. And they make up this mosaic of understanding, all seemingly unified under the, the problem that we were talking about a little earlier, which is the problem of consciousness and, what's real, what's not real. So it's unified under the context of the human mind. I see it being unified under psychological conditions. And I'm predisposed to think about it in that way. But obviously, that's coming from a one-sided view. I'm a human being. It makes sense to me to view it this way. The flip side is that, you're talking about Alan Watts and whether potato is more sort of intelligent than us, and it's hard to tell. I think even it can be trickier than that. Are we the actual entities that have autonomy here, or are the ideas in the framework of memetics and Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist? Are our brains just vessels for ideas to reproduce and act in a viral capacity? Everyone knows that YouTube videos go viral. Certain ideas, certain memes spread like wildfire across the internet. So ideas are very powerful. And are ideas the entities that are really the real thing here? that we only are a catalyst for. Basically, our brains are a substrate for these ideas to latch onto and drive us such that they can replicate. So there are all sorts of different ways to see this. In terms of what's real, I'm still a skeptic in some sense. I'm open to ideas. I understand logic. I understand evidence, but I also understand personal experience, which is where science falls short a lot of the time. So in terms of whether it's matter, whether it's information, whether it's something else, I don't think I'll ever be able to close the door on that, to be honest.
Well, never say never, I would say. But, one thing you made me think about is this rolls back to my experience working with American Express Innovation Labs. And this thing when you mentioned the YouTube videos go viral, that's certainly true. And one thing that we did when I was working there, it was quite open space in terms of let's try all sorts of different things. And we said, like, we want to make a bunch of videos go viral. How would we do that? So we went to the best media agency in UK that had literally this lab in the underground in the basement of their building that was purely to do with social media analytics across all these channels. And they could literally tell us what was going viral and when and how much and what was leading and so on. And then we started getting into the conversation around how would we make a video go viral? And that started becoming a lot more woolly kind of debate, because you don't want to replicate what the others have done, because then it becomes like, well, it's just the sort of Me Too type thing. So it almost like made me think that the meme theory is almost like in some sense, the things that really go viral are things that are uniquely different, but also appealing.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is what is really tricky to create, something that's perceived as totally different, yet it can be consumed in the same exact way like before. And that's where I think a lot of people fail. So what would you think about that differentiation factor?
No, I think you're on the money there with in terms of what will have a maximum impact. I still think there's value to be captured in copying a model that works. I mean, there's pennies on the dollar that can be made, but in terms of seeing what meme works most effectively, I think there are lots of I tend to relate everything back to Jung. There are lots of concepts from Jung that could be beneficial. Like you're aware, the archetypes are definitely one of those. And I believe that's built in, right? It's there's certain aspects of our brain evolution that effectively make it possible to have information wells. And how those information wells exist, it's hard to trace, but it's recognizable in the sense that certain archetypes are recognized by everyone: the mother archetype, the father archetype. These are just built-in mechanisms. And I believe there are yet undiscovered archetypes that would have a huge impact in terms of fulfilling an unconscious desire, but at the same time, allowing us to effectively discover different parts of our psyche that can be used for utilitarian purposes.
And so how do you see archetypes as we slowly venture into the Jungian psychology? How do you see archetypes, and how do you conceptualize of archetypes in terms of, are they fragments of the psyche, or are they building components of the psyche, or are they like fully fledged configurations of the mind, or something like that? What's your take on this?
I think, there are different aspects to archetypes. There's the image that we recognize as an archetype. So if, someone brought up the image of our mother, we'd instantly have warm feelings of the mother archetype. But if you were born to any other mother, you would use that picture as your archetype. So there's the experience-based aspects where it fills in these, what I call information wells, basically repositories for real-world experience in our minds. And that's obviously a function of our brain structure. So in terms of, understanding this from a mechanistic point of view, we have a certain brain, we've got a large prefrontal cortex. We've got the reptilian aspects at the core. There are certain archetypes that are just built into the structure of our brains. And I don't think we understand all of these, but we understand many of these different archetypes and how they are embedded in our thoughts. And so the specific archetypes in a personal lifetime are really a function of the information we put into these information wells, but they're a function of the information wells being there to begin with. If you have nothing, if you don't have a basket to store apples in, you're not going to be able to hold the apples, right? And so understanding this mechanism and what brain structures lead to specific archetypes, and what archetypes are impaired by specific brain damage would be a great study in terms of understanding what these archetypes are, where they live in the brain, and allow us to make progress in terms of understanding what would lead to potentially a fulfilling life.
So what I'm hearing is that you're thinking of archetypes almost as a physical imprint on the human, as opposed to like a conceptual template or even, let's say, psychological template.
That's right. I mean, they have to be connected. People like to separate this into the duality of the mind and the body, but they're intricately connected in a number of ways. And it's not just the physical aspects, but that's definitely part of it. And the way I like to think of archetypes is sort of like the equivalent of a phenotype in terms of DNA expression. So effectively, if you have an image that is associated or you resonate with, say you find a beautiful mate, or you have a specific occupation that just really sits well with you, or on the opposite side, you really hate, then there's something to that. And that's basically the equivalent of a phenotype in terms of DNA. The genotype itself is essentially the ideas, that the information wells that sit there. In terms of the DNA structure of what consciousness is, what intelligence is, I think that is effectively can be explored, but it's a yet unknown structure, just like we had the hunt for the DNA structure in the 60s and the 50s with Watson and Crick, and Franklin with her X-ray crystallography. I think the archetypes are a way to, again, to draw an analogy, is to get an image, almost like an X-ray crystallography, that will allow you to also connect it to a phenotype. And I think the really big breakthrough in psychology and intelligence and spirituality and all these things will come with understanding that that structure that uses the brain as a substrate to replicate the ideas.
I'm having to sort of soak that in a little bit as an answer. I'm going to have to re-listen to that on the recording and really unpick the statements that you made, because it's profound. And I have a feeling also that you have a better direct connection with this understanding than most people that I speak to, because I also notice I've been practicing this thing called statement analysis, which is what FBI interrogation agents use to detect whether someone is lying or whether they've killed someone and so on. So I pay attention a lot to how people speak. And when people speak directly without hesitation, it means that they've thought this through quite well and it's really connecting with their psyche, as opposed to they're having to sort of make it up as they go along and they're not quite sure. So they come up with a lot of ums and ahs and correct the words they say and all that kind of stuff. So that's where
Well, you don't want to play it back then, because I'm sure if you play it back, you'll hear plenty of ums and ahs from me. So,
well, I listen to a lot of people when I'm coaching people through Fresh Mind. In many respects, what they actually say is the least amount of information carrier compared to how they say it. And when I'm doing this, I also word for word take notes of what they're saying, but I also take notes of the nuances when they take pause or sigh or say or ah or twice or they repeat. Even in statement analysis, there's stuff like if you say I, it's a kind of, you're not sure of yourself. You're kind of having to reassure that you exist. There's a very sort of psychological meaning towards how people express the words. In many respects, people are always speaking their minds. In other words, you can't do anything other than just speak your mind. And so the question then comes is, what's the difference between brain and mind in your view?
yeah, it's a good question. Brain is obviously the physical object. It's the material side of who we are. It's not something that you can easily dismiss, right? And whether it creates the mind or the mind latches on to the structure of the brain is still an open question. I mean, it's framed as what they call the hard problem of consciousness. And Chalmers is renowned for establishing that problem in a formal way. I think, though, in some respects, it's not a difficult problem. There's a lot of ego tied up with our brains, status of genius, with our capacities. And these go a long way to preventing us from accomplishing great things for humanity, in my opinion. So really, should it matter what the difference is between a mind and a brain, or what we're using it for, and the pragmatic side of these questions? I don't think there's much to gain from delving too much into the brain versus the mind. And it could be just a construction of how we conceptualize things, right? Wouldn't it be ironic if that problem was framed incorrectly and we couldn't answer it because of our cognitive processes? Like, what's the irony there? You're trying to discover the nature of the brain or the mind, and you can't do it because of your biases and your psychological issues. I would think that was the case, and I would find it quite funny, actually.
It's funny in both ways, because if we're trying to communicate with one another, we're using words and language and some element of body language as well. And without those words, how do we discuss even concepts like consciousness, mind, architecture, atoms, any of these concepts that are actually quite nebulous, really, even though we might think, oh, we know in science what an atom is. It's like actually really not that easy to even define and describe and so on.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jason. I really like that idea. And it really drives to the concepts of some core problems that some very famous people have struggled with. You may be aware of individuals like Alan Turing,
Mhm.
who struggled with the ideas of potentially, an individual being able to be replicated by a machine and not being able to differentiate whether they're a person or a machine, and what really makes us a human. And I really like the idea that every person, like I said, is unique, um, and their words are unique as well. So even though we've got a common dictionary, and we're using potentially one word, even if we boil it down to the simplest case, we've got one word, one definition. That word means completely different things in different contexts for different individuals. And so you could have such a wide variety of variation, yet somehow we can work together and accomplish great things. It's quite miraculous in some sense. And in some sense, it makes me think that like a simulation theory of the universe might be correct, because each person is a permutation on a given structure, the brain, and we each have different words associated with different meanings. And if we go at problems from a group mentality, the diversity of thought is a real strength when it comes to solving problems. Even though we have slightly different definitions, if we approach it from all these different angles, we're bound to get to the right solution.
That's so fascinating that you say that, because again, designed company software that we're building is all about asking every employee in the company what they think about each area of the company. Both good and bad are very insightful, because if everyone in the company says they really hate the coffee or something like that, then it's really easy to change that for something else like a tea or a different type of coffee or some juices or whatever. And that actually changes people's perception of the whole company, and they start enjoying it suddenly. So uh, I've come to realize that the negative, and this is certainly useful in design, where sometimes we can play a design exercise where we just express all the negatives about a certain product or a service and just kind of air it all out, and then go, well, what would be the opposite of this? And in some sense, that might create, and certainly it inspires, a service design that is nearly perfect, or more closer to ideal of what we would want. Because otherwise the human brain and mind gets stuck as like, I'm not really sure. But when you're kind of prodded by this like, kind of thing that you hate, it's like, I hate waiting on the phone. So it's like, what's a good one? Well, it's like not waiting on the phone, again served straight away. It's like, okay, well, let's do that.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's like, oh, suddenly you're inspired because you actually saw this like extreme scenario that you don't want, and you so like viscerally don't want that you're now suddenly inspired to think of this opposite thing. So what's your then take on concepts like God and spirituality, and how do you reconcile all that with hard sciences? Both you and I are both engineers and scientists, and we're both spiritual, and riff on this kind of like, I don't really know what's going on, really. So, how do you reconcile this? And are there some sort of particular tricks or tips that you might be able to share with everyone who listens to this to kind of maybe even leverage these two both to kind of play them together, a bit like what we do in the design exercise of going, what do I hate? Let me produce something that I love from that.
Yeah, absolutely. It, from my point of view, I was an atheist. I was an atheist up until I was in my early 30s. Currently 37, so I haven't actually been in the spiritual world for too long. But um, I really did go through a journey where I had to develop my ego, and science was a part of that ego. In order to move over into the spiritual side of things and consider it seriously, because I don't think many scientists who are atheists, and they're atheists because they're scientists, actually realize that they don't consider it seriously. And there are certain fundamental ideas in science that prevent us from doing that. Certain things like repeatability. In science, you have to validate your result by repeating it over and over and over and over and over again. And that's fine, you know, if we were creating an O-ring for a valve, you know, but we're not O-rings and we're not valves. So everyone only has one life to live. And there's a certain, like I said, individuality and uniqueness with being who you are. You can't go back and relive your 14th year of life in order to, you know, refine your pickup line to get the girl you wanted when you were a teenager. You know, so we're going through this once. Statistics don't work for spirituality. If we rely on statistics to guide us as individuals, that's flawed. It's great to understand how to live in a society, but in order to explore the individual side of yourself, you need to let go of these preconceived notions that science gives you. They just don't work on a psychological level. They don't work on a spiritual level. So I don't necessarily think that they are at odds. And my concept of God really came about when I discovered that I was controlled by something that wasn't my conscious mind. I had experiences where, you know, I had something interesting happen to me, which I considered interesting at the time, not meaningful. They were just anomalies. But in hindsight, because I'm blessed with a good memory, I could remember several years before where something had happened. And in the light of current context, it was abundantly clear that the meaning of that moment in that time was to get me to this point in the future where they're immediately connected and significant. And because I can't repeat that, scientists won't accept it. But it's clear to me on a personal level that that really is the case. So recognizing this idea of the greater power of the unconscious, the self, the universal mind is really important to me. It's made a lot of desperate facts and figures and experiences cohesive. So my my personality type is ENTP, which predisposes me in some respects to seeking out unified theories. So this unification only made sense when I discovered the spiritual side of things.
Dude, as you're speaking, I'm having like a series of little minor like Kensho experiences, like tiny little awakenings within me, because what you were just saying is, and it really connects very nicely with Jungian psychology, that like the conscious mind, that subconscious mind is always processing at like 100 times the capacity of the conscious mind. And we have this ability to observe and notice things that otherwise conscious mind perhaps consciously ignores because it thinks it's not important at that point in time. Now, your capacity to memorize things perhaps in the subconscious and bring it out of the subconscious to then string together how a series of events brought you to where you are today, and how perhaps in my case, like for example, I went through war in Bosnia. You know, a lot of people go like they get stuck on like, there's a Siri comes up. I didn't ask you. Thank you very much. How war in Bosnia brings up Siri, God knows. But we might work out in 10 years' time. But a lot of people get stuck on something like war in Bosnia or being through war, not realizing that that actually brought me, for example, in my case, to meet my wife in London and then have children and live in UK and do everything that we're doing today, which I probably wouldn't be doing if I was in Bosnia. Probably if I was left in ex-Yugoslavia, I would be Nikola Tesla by now, but who knows? You don't know. There's still time. There's still time. Keep the faith. But the point is that the ability to connect memory points together into a grander narrative and ability to understand causes and consequences is perhaps one of the big reflections of high intelligence. And that's what would explain why quote unquote stupid people keep making the same mistake over and over again until they really kind of have that very harsh, visceral experience of going like, oh gosh, I shouldn't be doing that anymore. I should try something different and
Right.
innovate in my life.
Yeah, there's a quotation, a famous quotation about that. And I don't think it's necessarily framed as stupid people, but it's the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. You
Mm.
know, so it's even worse than stupidity. I'd rather be stupid than
Yeah, it's kind of stuckness, right? Where you
yeah,
don't
that's right.
have that idea, where you don't have that little Ken show happiness. Oh, I could try this.
Yeah.
And it works in every single thing. You play instrument or painting a picture or uh, perhaps don't tinker with atomic nuclear weapons. Oh, we could try this. Boom. But
Yeah.
so what is your then take on nuclear energy and these kind of different types of energy? Because one of the phrases or sayings is from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said, split an atom and at its heart you shall find the sun. First question is that true? Second is, what is the role of nuclear energy in all the other sort of sources of energy that we have? And I know that I'm asking perhaps a bias, you're hugely biased towards nuclear, but at the same time, you're aware of our biases. So how do you reconcile that stuff?
Yeah, I think to understand it from a fundamental level, which I like to do, I really see our energy resources as a real driver for any human progress. At some level, what you're getting is created from the nuclear energy because all of our energy on Earth is primarily coming from the sun. And it's, whether it's usually driven through photosynthesis and, it's that receives the energy, the plants feed the animals, and all of this drives the biosphere, which give our traditional forms of energy. And also, the wind and solar power are directly related to the sun as well. In terms of nuclear, it's sort of a special beast in that it's coming from deposits of heavy elements that we're digging out of the ground that naturally decay because they were created in an unstable star at some point as well. So some other sun, that is to say. And so if you do split the atom, there are different ways to do that. One is fission and one is fusion. I work with fission power, so effectively taking uranium, putting it in a configuration where it spontaneously breaks, or there's a fission, basically a breaking of the atom, which releases these neutrons. And the neutrons themselves are slowed down and redeposit in the fuel and lead to heat. So basically, it's just a fancy way to get heat. In terms of safety and those aspects, there's definitely a stigma around nuclear, and justifiably so. We've had some really significant events in my industry, just within recent memory, obviously. But it's one of those things. It's we took it out of the box. There's no putting it back. It's one of these things. It's a tool, and tools can be used for good or bad. And so I feel how we use this technology, and any technology for that matter, really is a function of how we treat ourselves and the stability of our civilization, which is highly dependent, again, on the psychology of the individual human being.
So is it true that if you split an atom, you shall find the sun?
Find the sun? No. Find energy that is equivalent in nature. coming from our sun? Yes. So if it's a metaphor, it's correct.
Yeah. So I think the idea is that there's so much energy in an individual atom that when you split it that way, that it can release huge amount of energy. That's what that's the spirit of that saying is.
Yeah, it really is. And it's many orders of magnitude larger than any other source, right? And I think that's one of the things people don't realize is that this is such an abundant source of energy, and it's fairly reliable. And the waste generated is but a fraction of what you're getting from fossil fuels. There are obviously proliferation issues with it. There are waste issues with it. But again, with any technology, even these so-called green energies, there are engineering issues that you have to deal with to create photovoltaic cells for the sun, to receive the sun. It takes some harsh metals to put those together in order to transfer the photons and turn them into electricity. So, there are issues with mining. And so, how we go about using these technologies and creating these technologies is another question. The life cycle of a technology really does have to come into play with respect to any new technology, even digital technologies for that matter. We don't really know what spending 80 years on a little electronic device is going to do to us, let alone our children, because all these children's now on smaller devices. What does that mean for their social interaction? What does that mean for their education? That's a positive, right? You can now have them educated as much as you want immediately, and restricting that. And these are all open questions. So really, at the end of the day, we need energy. I don't see that going away, especially with Elon Musk wanting to go to Mars and beyond. We're going to need all of our energy resources for the foreseeable future. And just in terms of scale as well, you made an interesting comment on the subconscious receiving 100 times more than the conscious mind. I actually looked it up the other day just because I was interested. So speak of coincidences. There's 11 million bits received by our subconscious every second, but only 50 bits are received by our conscious brain. So that's 6 orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
The arrogance of thinking we know how to solve these problems is on the same scale, I believe. If you think your conscious mind really knows what's going on, when your unconscious mind is receiving 1 million times more information, that's the height of arrogance, in my opinion. And it's almost on the same scale as the sun and the earth being at the center of the universe in a geocentric universe. It's quite a coincidence that the ratio of the Earth's volume to the sun is actually 1 million times as well. So I like to think about it in those concepts. So shifting your viewpoint from having the Earth to be the center of the universe to the sun is almost the same degree of error we're making when we're thinking that we're in control of everything going on in our minds.
That actually makes me wonder whether there is some sort of very deeply subconsciously ingrained and engraved reason for why so many ancient cultures have worshipped the sun as a kind of like almost like a very subconscious representation of the capacity of their own subconscious that they can't express in any other way than just kind of like sun, that's the thing, right?
Oh yeah, there are, and we could talk about this for hours, but I think the sun is the prototype for even the human anatomy. To be honest, if you were to not know anything, but you were a sensing organism, and you were just put out in the middle of a field somewhere, you would immediately look up at this bright object, right? And so there's no doubt in my mind that there's certain aspects, including the human eye, are shaped the way they are with circles and central points for focus. And even the areola and nipple reflect the same symmetry. And there are other reproductive symmetries as well. These are all the way they are because of our environmental influences structuring our brain in such a way that something of significance over in location A is comparable to something in location B. So if we have that, there's an inclination to go in that direction. So I think there are some deep connections to these patterns in the human mind, body, soul that are yet to be discovered, to be honest.
So that also brings up, I used to, a bunch of years ago, go to talks from a friend of mine, White Sang, and he wrote a book called Unified Fractal Brain Theory. And he basically makes this giant argument that the entire universe is a binary tree, and that like absolutely everything's connected in literally a binary tree fractal. And so that, if anything, again, it was just like having another Ken show here where I'm like now making fractal management system and then going like, gosh, I've spent so many hours listening to White Sang's lectures, and here I am kind of putting that stuff into practice in another sort of realm of existence, and it works really well. Why? Because the theory makes sense, underlining theory, which has all come out of our own subconscious, that seems to be sort of pre-programmed there. And so what is your relationship with Jungian psychology? Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll have one more question to wrap it up after that.
What is my relationship to Jungian psychology? So he's my spiritual guru. From an early age, I was different. Although I did fit in with peer groups, I knew I was separate from them in some respects. So there was very little bonding over deeper issues that I found amongst my peers of my own age. And so from an early age, I relied on reading and discovery of mentors through books. I found it opened up a wide world of new friends, to be honest. And with Jung, I was at a low point in my life where I was suffering through some personal issues and not knowing which way to turn. And like any good engineer, I did some research, which is actually quite tough when you're down on your luck and you're not feeling.
Yeah.
Pick yourself up by your own bootstraps is quite difficult.
Personally, I find research always tough because I'm having to confront the stuff that I don't really know about. It's like, gosh, I just don't know so much.
Right. Yeah, it's quite scary not understanding you don't know so much. But with Jung, it was just that it just came across my laptop while I was looking for answers. And as soon as I started to read, it was almost like he was living my 100 years ago, to be honest. Just the parallels, the questions he was asking, the personal trials and tribulations that he himself had gone through. And it just so happened, it wasn't just that one reflective experience that made me realize I was like him, but he had also reflected on his predecessors like Nietzsche and Goethe and these other great minds that have all gone through these experiences through life. And so my experience with him is a deeply personal one. He's literally the number one guru I have for understanding myself. And so he's my spiritual guide. He had Philemon as his spiritual guide. I actually picture Jung as my Philemon in my head.
One of the weirdest things that I seem to have come to realize through studying psychology and kind of really contemplating about a lot of these things is that, and Carl Jung had gone through his schizophrenic kind of phase, or was it schizophrenic, right? It was kind of like lost his mind for quite a
Yeah,
like
in
couple of
those days
years.
they called it dementia precox, but
Yeah,
it's the equivalent
yeah.
of schizophrenia.
So it's almost as if you got to all these kind of types of people that we tend to hate by default, like psychopaths, narcissists, la di la. You kind of almost have to empathize with them without losing your mind, not becoming like them, but actually sort of configure your mind to be like one and go, now I understand what it means to be like a psychopath, and I'm choosing not to. That's the exercise. And many people cannot even dare to even think about that, let alone exercise that and then exercise yourself out of that. Because the conscious process there is to say, I also have the capacity to be exactly like that, given the right circumstances. And I also have the capacity to choose not to be like that, no matter what the circumstances are. And that's where it's like a really, really, really dangerous thing that isn't recommended to be done by anybody who isn't really willing to face themselves.
Yes,
And so,
yes.
so my final question to you for this conversation, it would be wonderful to have another conversation because there's so many questions, is where would you like to see humanity be in 30 years time from now, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's the question every capable person should ask themselves, because we are writing the future at the very moment we're sitting here. And where do I want humanity to be? So I've this year I won the World Genius Directory Genius of the Year award, which is the who's who of the high IQ world. And I wrote a statement for the world. And I want everyone to realize that we're all connected. We're all the same. We're all humans. And these teachings aren't new. I've discovered some of these things, and I couldn't improve on this idea if I wanted to. We're all connected. We're all one, yet we're at the same time fundamentally different from one another. So just like you said, if we could learn to listen to one another and go to that place where that other person is, and meet them there in order to understand them as a first step, I think that would be enough to accomplish in a 30-year time frame. It sounds simple, but the emotional maturity it takes to get to that point where you're able to listen to another person, even in the heat of an argument, even in the heat of a fight, a physical threat. If you could just have the composure and compassion, compassion's the right word, for that other person, no matter who they are, that's the next big hurdle for humanity to get over. And if we could do that within 30 years, I would be ecstatic.
I have to ask us, it's a subset question just before we wrap up, which is that what does the world and humanity look like when everyone is fully self-actualized?
Um, it's it's a difficult one, because there are various landscapes that I can envision that would get us to a point where we're self-actualized. And you know, we've got a lot of people on this planet, and population is a problem. So again, talking first steps, those of us at the top have to reach down. There's no way to just expect those at the bottom to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, just based on external circumstances. there are a lot of influences to whether someone can achieve quote unquote success or not. But the first step is helping each other, reaching down, giving those people an ear, let them speak to you, let them tell you what they desire. Don't impose a vision of the future on them. They're more than capable of telling you what they want. And then hold hands with them as they work towards those goals. There's a degree of selflessness there that has to transpire. And so, there are different steps in this ladder. One of them is food, shelter, electricity, the base level, education, open education for the world, to be restricted to no one if they want access to it, to be open to spiritual aspects as well. We're in a world now where it's all driven by technology and science, and there's almost a taboo to talk about a belief in a higher power, at least in the Western world. And we can't start conversations having a debate. We need to start by listening to one another. And at that point, once we all realize our goals, we're all helping each other, we can get to that point where every individual on the planet can be self-actualized.
Fantastic. I love this conversation so much. I usually don't ever have any expectations, but I think with you, I kind of had expectations inevitably, but this kind of surpassed all my expectations. So I thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And hopefully we can do another one with further questions that have been popping up in the back of my mind, in the subconscious. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jason. It's always a pleasure to interact with you online, and it's nice to actually get a chance to speak with you face to face.
Awesome. All the best.